Let's continue on to mental illness. Mental illness is much more common in more unequal countries. Once again, we have the U.S. at the peak of mental illness. We have Japan at the lowest echelon. As you can see from this chart, mental illness and inequality are very much correlated. A quick glance at SSRI antidepressant drug visits to doctor's offices among adults 18 years of age or older in the United States from 1995 to 2002 shows a clear trend of growing dependencies on antidepressants. The most common type of disorders, of course, are anxiety and depression. A psychologist by the name of Jean Twenge did an interesting study which proved that Americans are much more anxious than they used to be. A survey of college students from 1952 to 1993 across 52,000 students found that students today were more anxious, than 85% of the population at the beginning of the study, meaning 1952. By the late 1980s, the average American child was more anxious than the child psychiatric patients of the 1950s. As far as depression, a study called Time Trends in Adolescent Mental Health found that in Britain, depression among people in their mid-20s was found to be twice as common in a study of 10,000 or so people born in 1970. 10,000 people study, twice as common in 1970 as it was in 1958. It also found that in general, psychosocial disorders affecting young people have risen substantially over the past 50 years. In Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain, 1 in 10 are deemed mentally ill in a year. In the UK, it's 1 in 5, and in the US, it's 1 in 4. Across entire populations, rates of mental illness are 5 times greater in the most unequal countries compared to the least equal. Now, of course, I know what you're saying. What about genetics? I think Richard Wilkinson summed it up very well. Although mental illness can be affected by changes in the levels of certain chemicals in the brain, nobody has shown that these are actually causes of depression, rather than changes caused by depression. Although some genetic vulnerability may underlie some mental illness, this cannot by itself explain the huge rise in illness in recent decades. Our genes cannot change that fast. And let's move on to the idea of trust. Another word for this is social capital. Social capital is defined as an attitude, spirit, or willingness of people to engage in collective civic activities. Hence, there's a strong trust relationship. As you can see in the chart, those that feel they can trust one another are much more common, naturally, in societies that have less inequality. This, of course, is beyond obvious, as I'm sure many would agree. Naturally, with greater inequality, people are less caring of one another. In fact, mistrust and inequality, I think, reinforce each other. Now, this point is probably enough for a 1-hour lecture in and of itself. What is a society if people cannot trust each other? It's important to realize that the idea of friendship and the notions that couple in with friendship, which is ultimately a quality of trust, is a characteristic completely opposed to the competition mentality and the economic theories of self-interest we see today. Empathy, reciprocation, and cooperation equates to good health, while suspicion, fight, competition always equates to high levels of stress and hence destruction. As we'll talk about in a second, stress is one of the deadliest killers that we know of. It's a secret killer. And living in a society where you have to look over your shoulder and where you have to fight for everything that you have, where you have to question virtually every transaction given the initial assumption that the person might be trying to pull one over on you for their own betterment. The fact of the matter is we thrive socially on trust and cooperation, provably by health standards. And social structures which create relationships based on inequality, inferiority, and social exclusion are inflicted with the greatest deal of social pain and neuroses. Let's move on to educational scores. This one's very interesting. Not only do more unequal countries have worse educational attainment, kids are more likely to drop out of school as well. Interestingly, class distinctions and their effect have become very obvious in this regard. For example, a study was done in 2004 where they took 321 high-caste Indian boys and put them with 321 low-caste Indian boys, and they were given a task of solving a certain problem. The first time they did this, the caste relationship, the social status, was not announced to these children. They had no idea who was around them. And you can see the caste unannounced, low caste actually beat the high caste. The second time they did it, the results were dramatically skewed, as the lower caste did much worse than before, while the higher caste did better. This is psychological. It's a psychosocial superiority relationship that has been repeated many times in many cases through other studies, which has the exact same consequence. People are greatly affected by their perceived status in society. When we expect to be viewed as inferior, very often we perform as such. Homicide rates. As you can see, the United States blows everything out of the water when it comes to homicide rates. And obviously, if you look at the regression trend, homicide rates are naturally more common in unequal societies. In fact, violence itself is probably the most established attribute of social inequality over any of the things that we're talking about in these examples. James Gilligan, who was a prison psychiatrist for 25 years, and he is currently director for the Center for Study of Violence at Harvard University, had this to say about his experience dealing with violent criminals to the extensive length that he has. The prison inmates I work with have told me repeatedly, when I asked them why they have assaulted someone, that it was because he disrespected me. The word disrespect is central in the vocabulary, moral value system, and psychodynamics of these chronically violent men. I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected, and ridiculed, and did not represent an attempt to prevent or undo this loss of face, no matter how severe the punishment. For we misunderstand these men at our peril if we do not realize they mean it literally when they say they would rather kill or mutilate others, be killed, than live without pride, dignity, and self-respect. They literally prefer death to dishonor. It's really easy to see how class relationships, and hence income inequality, can translate into feelings of humiliation, loss of control, disrespect, and ridicule. You know, when someone loses their job, it's often demoralizing. They say, oh, my husband's unemployed, and it's this demoralizing thing, oh, he's unemployed. After all, the very nature of class is hierarchical. In other words, the upper class really looks down upon the lower class, historically speaking. And to be looked down upon is essentially humiliating. Therefore, it should be no surprise why the United States has the largest number of homicides in the world, given its extreme income inequality. And this leads us to rates of imprisonment. The trend is very acute as well. Obviously, as we can see, imprisonment rates are much higher in unequal countries. The more unequal the country, the more people in prison. However, what is interesting about this reality is that it doesn't just relate to rates of crime, which of course is more prevalent in unequal societies, but it also has to do with the punitive attitudes toward the so-called criminal elements of society. In other words, the more unequal the society, the harsher the punishments are for a given offense. And hence, more people are put into prison for longer periods of time than they are in more equal countries. Since 1984, the state of California has built 1 new school and 20 new prisons. As an aside, for those out there who think the prison system might serve some therapeutic rehabilitation role in the modification of human beings and human behavior, I would like to refer back once again to our prison psychiatrist James Gilligan for his perspective. He states, the most effective way to turn a non-violent person into a violent one is to send him to prison. The criminal justice and penal systems have been operating under a huge mistake, namely the belief that punishment will deter, prevent, or inhibit violence, when in fact it is the most powerful stimulant of violence we have yet discovered.